What is Electrotech? This is a big question that Ember Energy is grappling with in its latest slide deck, its latest report. Dan, let's talk about. I'll back up a little bit here. Electrotech, from my understanding, is the big ones are wind solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, electric vehicles, and heat pumps, and maybe down the road, hydrogen electrolyzers. That's to be determined yet. But really, this is bigger than that, isn't it? There are so many other technologies connected here that are influencing the energy transition.
Yeah, well, exactly, Mark. So I would say solar and wind and EVs, to some extent heat pumps, they're kind of the poster child of what electrotech is. That's what everyone thinks about when you talk about this new generation of energy technologies that is disrupting the world. Often overlooked is what sits in between. So you have wind and solar on the supply side, EVs and heat pumps on the demand side. But what sits in between, these new connections, they're also incredibly exciting. So you get a very rapid rise of battery storage, just being able to store solar in the daytime so you can use it in the evening time to charge your EV, but also to shift on the demand side, just shift demand a little bit from hour to hour with batteries. Long, like high voltage DC cables that can connect not just countries with each other, but even continents with each other. That's how far these lines can go. These are completely new ways how we can connect supply and demand. And this is, I think, it has been overlooked. It's why we are talking so much at the moment about grid constraints and this kind of things in the energy sector, is because a lot of the focus has been on the supply side and the demand side of this transition. But the connections in between, I think, are at least equally interesting. And I'm not talking just hardware here. There's also a software component to this all, of course. So if we look at the rise of smart meters and then the smart controls and smart softwares that sit behind it, the amount of like just pieces of equipment that are connected to the internet right now, which can therefore be controlled, their energy and electricity use can be controlled with internet access, is just all on exponential curves. And this has all happened relatively recently. So the space of electrotech is much bigger than just the panels and the EVs. There is a very deep bench of further electrotech, primarily in this connection space, which I think is underappreciated, that most people don't see. And so it is not as easy to say as electrotech is simply rolling out these 4 or 5 technologies that we know. They can do a large part of the job of getting the electrotech revolution going, but there's a lot of other tech and enabling tech that sits around it. Think of, converters and inverters and just copper wires and smarter aluminum wires. And there's a lot of electrotech that is enabling where a lot of money can be made that doesn't sit directly there as a poster child, but it's still a huge market where if you win at that as a country, as a company, you still have billion-dollar markets opening up for you over the next decade or two.
I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, Dan, and I made the point that in Canada, at least, and of course, I'm looking at this through a Canadian lens. And in Canada, when we think of the energy transition, energy revolution, we think of renewables. We talk a lot about renewables on the supply side. We very seldom talk about demand technology. Now, it's not true, if you get to Europe and you get to Asia, but it's true in Canada. And I made the point that the actual real revolution here is on the demand side because we've been able to make electricity for 150 years, 125 years. We couldn't electrify transportation. We couldn't electrify economically home heating and cooling. We couldn't electrify industrial processes like industrial heat pumps and basically making heat and doing other jobs. We now can, and it's getting better and better and lower cost and higher efficiency all the time. And it's the electrification of the demand side that really requires it requires policy, it requires industrial strategies and so on. Would you agree or disagree?
I agree. And I think it's a sign of old energy thinking to think about the energy system from such a supply side, right? It is a little bit we started thinking about this concept of primary energy coming into the energy system, going to final energy and then useful energy, and then actual useful energy services that actually make us richer and more prosperous. So when we started thinking about this, like in the 70s with the oil crisis, when it was just an issue because the primary supply was not coming into the West. And so the IEA was founded and we started doing the accounting on like what is actually coming into the system. That was very useful for its time and has proven very useful over time, but it has locked our mindset on energy a little bit into what goes into the funnel rather than what comes out. And I think this is part of the Electrotech revolution is that it's kind of completely changing the script on how we need to think about energy. Rather than think about primary joules of energy that go in, we need to think about useful energy that comes out of our system, things we actually use. And once you take that as your primary sort of statistic, once you look at what do we actually need in terms of energy, then it becomes so much more obvious why some services are very efficient and others not, because it's just incredibly inefficient to burn fossil fuels to drive a car. It just becomes incredibly inefficient to run a heating system by burning gas and not the heat pump. But it's this inversion of thinking about the demand side first that is, I think, baked into the Electrotech revolution because there's just so much efficiency gains, especially on the end use side, that can be realized. And so, yes, it's a great sort of miracle that happened over the past 25 years, where not only is the physics of this so much superior to supply useful energy with Electrotech, but it's also the economics that have improved. So if we go back to the year 2000, maybe you can credibly economically electrify about 25% of the energy system with Electrotech. Today, that is well over 75% of the energy system because EVs became competitive, better heat pumps became available, industrial decarbonization solutions opened up. We even now have electric ships and electric aviation being piloted. So we have much more of the energy system opening up for electrification. And that means that it makes sense on the physics side, and it also makes sense on the economic side. And that's, again, where we see this convergence of technologies today into this decade of revolution that we're currently in.
Let's talk about the nature of energy as a technology, because your slide deck talks a lot about learning curves. And learning curves were discovered in 1936 by Jim Wright, an engineer, an aircraft engineer, who noted that every time they doubled the production of aircraft, their labor costs went down 15 or 20%. And so economists have codified that into the learning curve, almost like a law. That, so if you're when you double the production, the manufacture of solar panels, the cost is going to come down per watt. Same with wind turbines, same with electric vehicles, same with batteries. And that's why over the last 10 to 15 years, the costs have come down so radically, is because we're ramping up, we're scaling up manufacturing. And what that suggests is that as we go forward and deploy solar and all of these electrotechs at a greater scale, the cost curve is still going to continue to fall.
Exactly. And that's the exciting moment that we live in. We've been innovating on these technologies, cost innovating on them for decades. And as we scaled up, we learned how to make them better. And we had got economies of scale, orders of magnitude, cost reductions across these technologies. And they've just hit this cost tipping point today. But it doesn't end here because the S curves, we're just about to hit like the steep part of the S curve right now. So we're just about to take off. So there is a lot more scale to come. And if we keep these learning rates that we've now seen steadily being followed for the past 30, 40 years, if we keep them for another decade of this kind of S-curve uptake, very cheap technology, competitive technology today will just become irresistibly cheap in a decade from now. And this is the land that we're traveling towards. We're now still in a moment where sometimes one can make an argument that the competitiveness doesn't quite work, right? LCOE is not the perfect metric to look at wind and solar, and if you add batteries on top, it might just still not be quite competitive against some, Texas gas generation. So we're still in a little bit of a gray zone on, is this now obviously competitive or is it just in some cases competitive? That is changing as we speak. In a decade from now, that conversation will be entirely gone. This will get cheaper and cheaper, and there will be just no conversation in 2035 about which technology is actually the cheapest one and the best technology to deliver cheap energy.
Here at Energy Media, we have a little 4-point model when we evaluate technologies, new technologies, and why people adopt them. First one is CapEx. What does it cost you to buy? The second is OpEx. What does it cost you to operate? And then there's risk. New technologies might break. They might not work as advertised. It's the fourth one that really is the X factor here. It's value. Because you can't always put a price. You can't put a price on status. You can't put a price on comfort. You can't, right? But because when you were talking about learning curves and prices, things becoming cheaper, I could hear the economists in the audience going, yeah, but you can't reduce costs infinitely. True, but even when things become cheap, then they become better. They perform better. The value they provide continues to grow, even when now they're very cheap, but what you get out of them every year is going up and up and up. And I think that then, if you view it through that lens, the long-term improvement of Electrotech and its ability to, be used universally becomes more understandable.
I fully agree, Markham. And I think one of the interesting things, I would say value for me almost splits up into two sort of pieces of evidence that we see, or two things to get excited about. One of them we reference in the report in one of our charts as well. It's just that Electrotech, on like the basic specs, just get better and better. Solar panels become more efficient, wind turbines are getting bigger, batteries become more energy dense, heat pumps become more powerful in pumping heat. These are all just the technical elements where you just see, even if the capex hasn't gone down, for instance, for heat pumps, they are so much more powerful today than they used to be, that the value is going up and up. The second element of value is, of course, the new business models that we're building around these technologies. We're still getting used to how to exactly implant these technologies into our lives. That is what we're seeing happening right now with companies between Octopus and other of these like digital integration companies that make it exciting and not just cheaper, but also just nicer to own these Electrotech technologies. At the moment, I think we're still fighting this battle very much on making the business model and the experience of owning Electrotech as good as the counterfactual. That is still the conversation. I think what we're moving towards is actually finding business models that make Electrotech much easier and simpler than the existing system. And I don't mean that on the tech specs. There we already see it superior, but it's about how to integrate. If your installer comes by, how easy is it to ask your installer to install a heat pump versus a gas boiler? If they're not trained at doing that, then it becomes harder. If you need to go a very difficult route to finance this, it's going to be harder to implement. And I think this is what we're currently innovating on is almost no more the tech. Of course, the tech will keep getting better, but the business models that we build around the technology. And I think this is where the trillion-dollar opportunity lies right now in the world, is people that make the business models around the superior tech feel so easy and nice to use that the technology, which is undoubtedly better than fossil fuels, also feels much better in terms of buying it, deploying it, operating it.
That's a very good point. And I have an anecdote to illustrate it. I interviewed a young Costa Rican engineer, and he went to Detroit, got himself an electrical engineering degree, got some experience, went back to Costa Rica, where they have a notoriously unreliable power grid. And so there are factories in Costa Rica, and he used the example of an ice cream factory. You just can't go down, right? You have to keep the ice cream cold all the time. So he went to them and he said, I will bring cheap Chinese solar, cheap Chinese batteries, and cheap Chinese digital controls, and I will integrate them into a system that will allow you to store energy so that if you have it'll lower your costs, but if the grid ever goes down, you can then keep the factory running and you don't have all of these problems. And his model, that's a business model, and we'll call it a Electrotech integration business model. And now he's doing a great business and expanding all over Latin America. And I've interviewed enough of these kinds of entrepreneurs, you can start to see the process happening. People are going, the light bulb is coming on for more and more entrepreneurs. And they're going, hey, if I do this, I can make, money at this. And we're just seeing that in North America. I suspect that in Europe and Asia, that process is more advanced.
I suspect so too. And I think in part also, Markham, is because, I mean, to have a little bit of an Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson abundance idea behind this, I think it's also because we've become in the West very, or maybe too attached to our current policy structures and our current regulation structures that we're so skittish to change anything about it. So if a new entrepreneur comes up with a great idea for a new technology and they want to roll that out, or a new business model and they want to roll that out with certain financing structures or other things, but it doesn't fit in the regulations, how long does that take across the West anywhere to actually have a regulatory change to make sure that you can start deploying this technology? That could take a very, very long time. And this is part of the reason why we, I think, see so much innovative potential also in Asia, is because we have policymakers that are taking more risks and they're just trying something out. Or maybe they give special dispensations to, let's try out microgrids, let's try out these different types of systems, because we're excited for what it can bring our people, and we don't see it as a nuisance to change our laws, because laws are there to be changed if it's for the betterment of our society. And I think this is a part of our argument in our Electrotech revolution as well, is if we want to unlock the power of Electrotech, we need to continue tinkering with all of this amazing technology. But we also need to tinker equally with our soft infrastructure of society. We need to not just build hard wires from A to B, but also soft connections between regulators and business leaders to make sure that you work together to make this happen. And I think that is one of the reasons why we see at the moment a lot of innovative potential also leaving the West. And Europe is, of course, has a huge issue with this. It's because regulation is stifling. And it's not just because there is regulation. It's not that regulation is inherently bad. We need it. And so, in some cases, we need more regulation. But it's so rigid and inflexible. And it's so slow to move. And if that remains so slow to move, no matter how fast we could innovate within our own borders of the West on new electrotech, it will be very hard to ever lead on deployment or actually innovative business models. And I think that's one of my worries for the West, and one of the things that we really want to get out there also with this report is it is amazing. We're innovating like crazy on the hardware side. We're innovating like crazy on the hard infrastructure. But please, please, let's not forget that the soft infrastructure also needs a lot of innovative potential and a lot of innovative power to get there.
Our energy transition theory of change incorporates ideas from Professor Clay Christensen from the Harvard Business School, who talked about disruptive innovations. When you have a new technology that is actually better than the old technology, and so the startup arrives on the market and they introduce this innovative disruption, and customers start to migrate over to the startup, the incumbent has to then respond. And that's very difficult for incumbents. And so if you think of the West as an incumbent whose business model has been disrupted by all of this startup technology that's better and customers are migrating over to it, the problem is re-engineering your business model. When you have an existing business model, inertia keeps you going for a long time in the same direction, and changing direction to incorporate, as you just said, new business models, new technologies, new hardware is very, very difficult. And I think that's part of what you're seeing in the United States, in particular, with President Donald Trump, favoring fossil fuels, is it's a kind of a backlash. The incumbents don't want to change. They prefer not to change. They push back against it. And the more nimble startups in places like China and Vietnam and Thailand and wherever don't have the same constraints. Would you agree?
I would agree, and it's one of the reasons why. So sometimes we get people reading our work and saying, "Oh, this looks so rosy and so optimistic," and we get such optimism from it. And I find that to some extent funny, because yes, if we look at it through the lens of carbon emissions, there is more optimism than in the average report in there. I think we can get much further and much faster than people think. But if we look at this through the lens, for instance, of geopolitics, this is not a rosy report, specifically not for people that live in the West. There's a lot of geopolitical upheaval coming our way. And I really like your bringing that you bring in Christensen here because it's one of the things that we've been kind of thinking about and worrying about is that to what extent is there not just yeah you have the innovator's dilemma, but maybe to some extent you also have the sort of the empire's dilemma here. It's like as if you are a large powerful country, to what extent don't you undergo exactly the same dynamics as Christensen describes in his book? You become like your regulations and your policies are the same as company policies and company regulations and company rules. The rule book that your CEO makes is the same as the rule book as your prime minister makes. And so, as an entire country together, if we keep chaining ourselves physically with the assets, but also just mentally in the way of our thinking to the fossil fuel industry, if we keep doing that, then there's going to just be a innovator's disruption here on a whole different scale where we won't just see Kodak fail, but we'll see countries fail. And that is one of the things that we find very scary and why I actually feel that when I read our report, I actually get a little bit of a pit in my stomach because that's the part that we are really afraid of. That's the reason, one of the reasons we want to go out with this report in the way that we did. It's a new view on energy. We do not talk much about carbon in our report. This is an energy dominance and an energy abundance story, and there is room for everyone at the top of this Electrotech revolution. The top is wide and broad, but you do need to get there. And if you don't get there, if you don't surf this Electrotech wave, you will be dragged under.
I want to bring in another idea from Christensen, and that is that there is no company too big to fail. That once your business model is disrupted, once your economy is disrupted, you can fail. Canada could fail as a state. And now I'm overstating it, of course, because that there's plenty of Canada and the United States and other countries in the same position have much more diverse economies than just energy, and so they might not become a failed state, but they might lose their perch at the top of the developed economies list, and their prosperity might fall, and incomes might fall, and on and on and on. So it's not even as so much as failing as declining, and that is not well understood in Canada, where we see the oil and gas industry in particular pushing back. So on that note, maybe we'll end the interview here. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Markham.